Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show built entirely around the source material you share with us, where we take the densest topics and distill them into actionable, unforgettable knowledge.
Today, we are profiling a man whose work, well, it really defines the entire information age, yet his name remains largely unknown outside of, engineering and mathematics circles. We're diving into the life and world-changing ideas of Claude Shannon.
And that's the central paradox of our deep dive today, isn't it? Our sources describe him as the most important genius you've never heard of, and his achievements are legitimately held in the same conceptual tier as Newton and Einstein.
Absolutely.
You ask people who invented the digital world, and, they say Turing, they say Gates, maybe even Jobs. But Shannon is one whose intellectual blueprint they all built on.
And that analogy to Newton or Einstein, it's not hyperbole. It really reflects the foundational nature of his contribution. Shannon is correctly titled the father of information theory. He provided the first ever universal quantifiable definition for the concept of information itself.
And for you, the listener, we are not talking about some abstract history here. The relevance is immediate. Every single digital system in your life, the way your Wi-Fi router communicates, how your phone compresses and transmits data, the error correction that makes streaming video possible.
The fidelity of a compact disc.
All of it. Every bit of it is a direct conceptual descendant of his foundational 1948 paper.
And we have a really rich collection of sources on Shannon, revealing a true polymath who didn't just transform one field, but three: mathematics, engineering, and artificial intelligence.
And there's this remarkable pattern, right? He consistently solved these complex practical problems by reducing them to simple, elegant, abstract mathematical structures.
He did. He found the simple truth inside the mess.
Plus, he managed to do all this while, literally juggling three balls and inventing devices like plastic foam water-walking shoes and flame-throwing trumpets.
You can't forget the flame-throwing trumpets.
Never. So our deep dive mission today is simple. We want to extract the key conceptual breakthroughs that gave birth to the digital world, and to understand the unique mind that saw a universal logic hidden in a simple electrical switch.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this journey, starting right at the beginning in Gaylord, Michigan, where Claude Shannon was born in 1916. The forces suggest he was one of those rare children whose natural inclination was just towards solving problems with his hands.
Oh, absolutely. His childhood truly sounds like a training ground for a systems engineer. He had an incredible aptitude for mechanical and electrical things and, a relentless drive to build.
And this wasn't just hobbyist tinkering, right?
No, not at all. The sources detail projects that show a really early understanding of complex physical systems.
So give us an example of that early ambition. What was he building?
Well, there was his construction of sophisticated models like early planes and a really detailed radio-controlled model boat. But the defining story, I think, is the sheer single-minded focus required to build a barbed wire telegraph system.
Oh yeah, I love this story.
It extended a full half-mile from his house to a friend's house. This wasn't some off-the-shelf kit. This required real electrical ingenuity and patience to build a fully functional communication link across fields.
It's almost like connectivity was in his DNA, even then. And there's that wonderful, almost mythic detail that his childhood hero, Thomas Edison,
Get this.
was actually a distant cousin of his.
Yeah.
It really reinforces this idea that this blend of mechanical intuition and electrical prowess was almost a family inheritance.
It seems so. But the real intellectual framework, that started when he went to the University of Michigan in 1932. And crucially, he didn't just choose one path.
Right.
He graduated 4 years later with dual Bachelor of Science degrees, one in electrical engineering and one in mathematics.
And why was that dual path so absolutely crucial to the digital revolution?
Because it gave him the two tools necessary to solve a problem that really nobody else even saw was a problem. The mathematics degree introduced him to the work of the 19th century British mathematician George Boole.
And Boole's work, Boolean algebra, that had always been seen as this pure, abstract system of logic, right? Defining rules for statements that could only be true or false.
Exactly, just an intellectual exercise. Meanwhile, the engineers were struggling with physical circuits, just tangles of wires and switches. Shannon was the one who brought the two together.
And this convergence happened during his master's work at MIT. This is where he writes the document that many call the most important academic document of the 20th century. His 1937 thesis, a symbolic analysis of relay and switching circuits.
This is truly the intellectual ground zero for the digital age, and we really need to slow down and appreciate the context here. Shannon was working for the legendary Vannevar Bush on his electromechanical differential analyzer.
Which was this massive early analog computer designed to solve differential equations.
A beast of a machine. And how are these early computers built?
With just a complicated mess of parts?
Basically, yeah. They relied on thousands of electromagnetic relays, which are essentially just mechanical switches that open or close a circuit. When engineers needed the machine to perform a logical function, they would manually wire up a tangle of these relays. It was a completely ad hoc process.
For trial and error.
Pure trial and error. They'd arrange the circuits until they got the desired output, but there was no underlying mathematical theory guaranteeing efficiency or even correctness. It was craft, not science.
So if you wanted to perform a new calculation, you basically had to rebuild a piece of the machine.
Exactly. Each machine was bespoke, complicated, prone to failure, and incredibly expensive because you had to use the maximum possible number of relays just to be sure it would work.
And Shannon looked at this complexity.
And he realized that the physical state of that simple electrical switch perfectly mirrored Boolean logic.
Okay, let's go deeper into that aha moment.
Yeah.
How does a physical switch relate to true and false?
It's so elegant. If a switch is closed, current can flow. That's true or 1. If the switch is open, the current is blocked. That's false or 0.
Simple enough.
Right. And Boolean algebra defines how you combine these true-false statements. For example, the logical statement A and B is true means both switch A and switch B must be closed for the circuit to complete.
So he mapped the abstract rules of logic directly onto the physical rules of electricity.
And he didn't just suggest the connection. His thesis was the mathematical proof. He proved that any logical numerical relationship, and that includes all arithmetic operations like addition and subtraction, could be constructed using these simple electrical applications of Boolean algebra.
That's monumental. It means you can mathematically design a circuit, you can simplify the number of relays needed to achieve the same result, and you know definitively, before you even lift a screwdriver, that the circuit will be logically perfect.
It transformed circuit design overnight. The engineers who had been using guesswork could now look at their complicated relay arrangements and use Shannon's algebraic laws to simplify them drastically.
And he showed how this worked in practice, right?
Oh yeah, he demonstrated it beautifully in the context of telephone call routing switches, showing how these algebraic rules could reduce the number of required switching components, saving immense amounts of money and hardware space.
It moved digital design from this chaotic, expensive art form practiced by experienced engineers
to a predictable, standardized, and scalable science. That quote from Goldstein about it being surely one of the most important master's theses ever written almost seems like an understatement now.
It really does. It established the fundamental theory behind all digital circuits in computing.
And this approach, based on pure abstract mathematics, it completely superseded the previous ad hoc methods. Even the concurrent work being done by other clever engineers like Akira Nakashima in Japan. Shannon's use of theory, rather than just grounded engineering practice, is what made it universally applicable.
And it was recognized immediately. It won him the 1939 Alfred Nobel Prize.
A huge deal.
But his unique cognitive pathway didn't stop there. He didn't immediately jump into building the first digital computer. Instead, his PhD, which he finished in 1940, took him in a completely different direction.
He jumped from electrical engineering and logic to theoretical genetics. His math PhD was titled An Algebra for Theoretical Genetics. Vannevar Bush had actually suggested the idea, wanting a mathematical framework for Mendelian genetics.
Genetics and Boolean circuits. That's an incredible, almost impossible leap for one mind to make in less than 3 years.
But it illustrates his defining genius, doesn't it? His ability to look at any profoundly complex system, whether it's the flow of electrons through a switch or the inheritance of traits across generations, and ask, what is the simplest, most abstract mathematical structure that describes this system?
How complex was this genetics work? I mean, was it groundbreaking?
It was pioneering. He devised an algebraic expression that described the distribution of several linked traits in a population after multiple generations under a random mating system. This was a theorem that other population geneticists of the time hadn't worked out. And while the thesis was largely unpublished until much later, it just demonstrated his mastery of applying abstract algebra to fields where it was previously unseen.
And this discipline-agnostic approach was then cemented during his National Research Fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Study, right?
Precisely. His 2 years there, encountering intellectual titans like Einstein and von Neumann, it just cemented his belief that finding a simple, unifying mathematical theory is superior to any complex, ad hoc engineering solution. This period provided the crucial transition, solidifying his core methodological principle, which he carried right into his next critical phase of work during the war.
Right. So the war effort quickly brought Shannon's unique talents to Bell Labs, where he focused on national defense, primarily in fire control systems and cryptography.
And his work under the National Defense Research Committee, the NDRC, was intensely practical and, of course, highly classified. Fire control systems involved the incredibly difficult task of predicting where an enemy missile or plane would be in the next few seconds.
Based on noisy, inconsistent radar or observation data.
Exactly. In order to aim an interceptor, it's a brutal problem.
And this problem, the noise, the prediction, the inconsistency, that naturally primed his thinking for information theory, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The analogy he and his colleagues used became foundational. In their 1945 report, Data Smoothing and Prediction in Fire Control Systems, they modeled the problem of tracking the enemy target by analogy with the problem of separating a signal from interfering noise in communication systems.
So they were treating a physical target tracking problem as a mathematical communication problem.
Yes. Distinguishing the signal, the true position of the target, from the noise, which is the interference, the error, all the junk.
This focus on filtering and systems thinking also led to an important side invention in 1942.
Yes, his invention of signal flow graphs. While analyzing the massive, complicated feedback loops within analog computers, he needed a better way to visualize the flow and relationship of variables. The result was signal flow graphs and the topological gain formula.
So yet another example of him imposing a clean, visual mathematical structure onto a complex, messy technological system to make it understandable and predictable.
That's his signature move.
Then, in early 1943, history brings together two of the greatest minds of the century. Shannon meets Alan Turing.
This was a fascinating, almost serendipitous meeting. Turing had been sent to Washington from Bletchley Park to share Britain's cryptanalytic methods with the Americans, particularly concerning German U-boat ciphers. They spent about 2 months together, often discussing mathematics over tea time in the Bell Labs cafeteria.
So what was the significance of that contact for Shannon? What did he learn?
Well, Turing shared his seminal 1936 paper defining the universal Turing machine. And this theoretical concept of a machine capable of performing any calculation was a huge validation for Shannon.
So it reinforced his own thinking.
Exactly. It reinforced his own thinking about the abstract mathematical limits and possibilities of computing and information handling that he had already begun exploring in his MIT thesis. It was less about teaching Shannon something new and more about confirming that the most advanced mathematical thinking on both sides of the Atlantic was converging on the same core ideas.
Okay, so if his thesis was the birth of digital circuits, his subsequent wartime work gave us the theoretical basis for digital security.
That's the perfect way to frame it. His highly classified wartime memorandum, completed in September 1945 and finally declassified and published in 1949 as Communication.The of Sensi Systems, is one of the most critical papers in the history of cryptography.
Why is it considered so foundational?
Because it moved cryptography from an art of secret codes to a branch of applied mathematics. It definitively marked the end of classical cryptography and the true start of the modern era. His framework directly influenced the development of modern symmetric key cryptography, including algorithms like DES.
The data encryption standard.
And later, AES, the advanced encryption standard, which we still use today.
So what was the game-changing insight he published in that paper?
Well, the biggest breakthrough was the mathematical definition and proof of unbreakability. Shannon was the first to mathematically prove that the cryptographic one-time pad is theoretically unbreakable, provided some very strict conditions are met.
I think many people understand the one-time pad conceptually. You mix a random key with your message. But what are the specific requirements that Shannon proved must be met for it to be truly unbreakable?
He established 4 non-negotiable requirements. These elevate the one-time pad from just a good practice to a mathematically perfect one. First, the key must be truly random, derived from a source of genuine physical randomness.
Not just computer-generated randomness.
No, true physical randomness. Second, the key must be at least as long as the plaintext message itself. Third, and this is crucial, the key can never be reused, in whole or in part, for any other message.
Ever.
Ever. And finally, of course, the key must be kept absolutely secret.
So he didn't just invent the perfect lock. He mathematically defined the exact conditions under which the lock must be perfect.
Exactly. And this set the theoretical boundary. When we look at modern ciphers like AES, they are computationally secure, meaning they take thousands of years to break with current technology, but they are not theoretically unbreakable like the one-time pad.
Why not?
Because they fail one or more of Shannon's 4 requirements, usually the key size or the non-reuse condition. It's just because key distribution and management for a true one-time pad is logistically impossible for massive digital communication. Shannon showed us the theoretical limit that all practical systems have to strive toward.
And this clarity of defining security boundaries led him to his most enduring advice for security professionals,
Yeah.
Shannon's maxim.
This is his practical adaptation of the earlier Kirchhoff's principle, and it is the guiding star of modern security design. He summarized it concisely. The enemy knows the system.
But wait, doesn't that sound almost obvious today? Why was that a groundbreaking shift in perspective for wartime and early digital cryptographers?
Because it runs completely counter to human intuition. Most people, when they're trying to hide information, they try to bury the mechanism. They practice security through obscurity.
Right, they think if their algorithm is complex enough, the enemy will never figure it out.
Exactly. Shannon's maxim forces a radical shift in mindset. If you assume the adversary has the entire cryptographic algorithm, the software, the hardware, the schematics, the only thing left to protect is the key.
So the complexity of the algorithm is irrelevant to security. Only the quality and secrecy of the key matter.
Precisely. It encourages robust, open-source algorithm design. If your system is so weak it can be broken even when the algorithm is secret, it's useless. Security must rely entirely on the key's strength and secrecy. This maxim governs everything from how we design encryption standards to how we handle user passwords today. It's a call for intellectual rigor in the face of inevitable compromise.
That wartime experience, linking signal tracking and cryptography, it was the perfect crucible for his true magnum opus, which arrived in 1948, a mathematical theory of communication. This wasn't just a great paper. This was the moment Shannon defined the fundamental currency of the digital world.
It truly was the blueprint. Robert Gallagher called it a blueprint for the digital era, and its influence quickly earned it the title, the Magna Carta of the Information Age. Before this paper, communication was largely analog, physical, mechanical. After this paper, communication became a quantifiable, abstract, mathematical problem.
Okay, so what does this all mean? If someone asked you to define the single core concept of the paper, what would it be?
It's the formal definition of information entropy, denoted by the letter $. This is the mathematical measure of the information content, or, more simply, the uncertainty contained in a message source.
The higher the uncertainty, the more information is conveyed when that uncertainty is resolved by receiving the message.
That's it, exactly.
So a random coin flip, which has 2 equally possible outcomes, has high information content. But if I send you a message saying the sun rose today, which is certain, it has 0 information content in the Shannon sense. It's a measure of surprise.
Exactly right. It's a measure of surprise. And this concept has 2 absolutely critical practical consequences that underpin all modern telecommunications.
Okay, let's delve into those. What's the first one?
The first is the source coding theorem, or sometimes called the noiseless coding theorem. If you quantify the information entropy $, of a source, say, the entropy of English text or the entropy of a photograph, Shannon proved that $, represents the theoretical absolute minimum number of bits needed, on average, to transmit that message.
So that's the theoretical limit for data compression. You literally can't compress data below its intrinsic information content.
Correct. Shannon showed engineers and computer scientists how much they could theoretically compress a file like a JPEG or an MP3 without losing information. Any algorithm that gets close to $, is a great compression algorithm. Any algorithm that tries to go below $, will necessarily lose data and distort the message.
This provided the first mathematical basis for all efficient compression technologies we use.
All of them. And to quantify this information, he introduced the necessary unit, a bit. He formalized and popularized the term bit, short for binary digit. The bit is the fundamental choice between 2 possibilities, 0 or 1, yes or no. It is the universal currency of information exchange, and it is hard to imagine the digital world functioning without this core, agreed-upon quantification.
The 1948 article became so influential it was published as a book, The Mathematical Theory of Communication, and that included a crucial explanatory contribution from Warren Weaver. Why was Weaver's edition so critical for the public understanding of information theory?
Well, Weaver provided the crucial context for the non-specialists, especially for those in fields like the humanities or psychology who were keen to use the theory. He clarified the distinction between the technical level of communication, which was Shannon's focus, and the semantic level, which is all about meaning.
So the difference between what you could say versus what you do say.
Yes. Shannon's entropy measured the efficiency and fidelity of the channel. How many bits could be successfully transmitted? Weaver made sure people understood that the theory says nothing about the profoundness, truth, or meaning of the message itself. This distinction was vital in preventing the misuse of the theory, which Shannon himself later warned against, while still ensuring its widespread technical adoption.
Okay, we've covered compression. What was the second profound consequence of the 1948 paper?
That would be the channel coding theorem, sometimes called the Shannon-Hartley theorem. If the source coding theorem tells you how much you can compress data, the channel coding theorem tells you the absolute maximum rate at which information can be transmitted reliably over a communications channel that is inherently noisy.
That's a massive concept. We have noise everywhere. Static on the radio, interference on the phone line, thermal noise in optical fibers. It's unavoidable.
It is, and Shannon derived a formula that defined the capacity $7 of a channel, the maximum data rate you can achieve without error. He proved that even in the presence of noise, reliable communication is possible, provided the transmission rate does not exceed the channel capacity tolerance.
So he gave engineers the mathematical upper bound for all real-world communication systems, from DSL to 5G to deep space probes.
Exactly. Engineers suddenly knew the theoretical limit of their fiber optic cable or radio frequency band, telling them exactly how fast they could transmit data before errors made the communication completely useless.
Galland compared Shannon's influence to that of the inventor of the alphabet. If that's true, Shannon didn't just write a good paper. He provided the language and the grammar for every digital breakthrough that followed.
That's absolutely correct. The theory defined the physics of digital communication. This is why its reach is so vast. Every major data standard, every piece of compression software, every system that manages error correction.
Which is what allows you to recover corrupted data on a CD or during an internet download.
Exactly. The entire architecture of the modern internet exists because of this framework.
And beyond the 48 paper, Shannon continued to apply this statistical mindset to language itself.
Yes, his 1951 work, Prediction and Entropy of Printed English, is a cornerstone of computational linguistics and natural language processing. He aimed to find the statistical structure inherent in English, the redundancy and predictability that allow us to communicate efficiently.
And he proved that human language isn't optimally dense. It contains a lot of redundancy. Why is that redundancy so important?
It's vital for error correction and interpretation. I mean, if English were maximally efficient with very low entropy, missing one letter would make the whole word unguessable. Because English is redundant, we can recover information even if it's garbled. Shannon showed statistically that English is roughly 50% redundant.
And he also uncovered a specific detail about language structure that was quantifiable.
He did. He explored how we represent language statistically. He proved that treating the space between words as a 27th letter of the alphabet actually lowers the overall uncertainty in written language.
Why is that?
Because the frequency with which certain letters are followed by a space, or not followed by a space, it adds structure and predictability. It reduces the overall entropy. This provided a quantifiable link between a cultural writing practice and probabilistic cognition. It's fascinating.
Beyond data and language, Shannon also provided the foundation for converting the old analog world into the digital one.
This is the third pillar of his technical genius. Shannon is credited with introducing the sampling theorem. He had derived this as early as 1940, but it became essential for the transition to digital telecommunications in the 1960s.
So what problem did the sampling theorem solve?
Okay, so analog signals like sound waves are continuous. To digitize them, you have to measure them at discrete points in time. The question is, how frequently must you measure the continuous wave to perfectly capture all the information in it? The sampling theorem provides the mathematical answer.
Which is?
The sampling frequency must be at least twice the maximum frequency component of the analog signal.
So if you sample a sound wave at too low a frequency, you lose the high-pitched information, distorting the sound.
Exactly. The sampling theorem provides the rule for avoiding that distortion, which is known as aliasing. It's the mandatory rule for turning a continuous signal into a discrete sequence of numbers that can be stored or transmitted digitally.
And once you have those samples, you need to encode them, which brings us to pulse code modulation, or PCM.
Right. Shannon co-developed PCM alongside Bernard M. Oliver and John R. Pierce at Bell Labs. PCM is the standard method used today to digitally represent those analog samples. You take the amplitude of the signal at the discrete time points, which are defined by the sampling theorem, and you encode that amplitude into binary digits.
So the sampling theorem tells you when to measure, and PCM tells you how to encode that measurement into ones and nullers. They work in tandem.
They are the fundamental gateway between the physical world and the digital world. They are why we can record, transmit, and play back digital audio and video with such high fidelity.
Here's where we see his unique intellectual skepticism at work, though. By 1956, information theory had become a sensation, and Shannon felt compelled to write an editorial called The Bandwagon.
He was deeply troubled by the reckless application of his theory. He provided a tool, a measure of statistical uncertainty, but people were trying to use information entropy as a magical framework to explain everything from literary meaning to psychology and even the stock market.
He was essentially saying, my math measures the complexity of the delivery system, not the wisdom of the package being delivered.
Precisely. His editorial warned that the popularization risked diluting the scientific integrity of the work. He advocated for thoroughly scientific attitude and rigorous proof before applying information theory to new domains. It showed remarkable intellectual humility and rigor, the architect of the information age, warning people not to worship the new framework he had created.
What's truly astonishing about Shannon is that while he was defining the limits of communication and securing war efforts, he was, at the same time, basically inventing the field of artificial intelligence.
That simultaneous invention, it speaks volumes about his focus. Shannon's approach to any complex system was always, can I reduce this to a simple, abstract, and predictable set of rules? And that question is the very definition of early artificial intelligence.
We see this most clearly in his role as a co-organizer of the 1956 Dartmouth workshop.
Yes. That summer workshop, organized with intellectual giants like John McCarthy, Marvin Minsky, and Nathaniel Rochester, is universally recognized as the foundational event of the discipline of artificial intelligence. They asked, can we get machines to learn and think? Shannon's presence and his earlier work on automata lent huge credence to the idea. He also co-edited the influential book Automata Studies that same year.
But his earliest and maybe most memorable contribution to AI was something physical and charming. Theseus, the mouse.
Theseus, built in 1950 with the help of his wife Betty, is a magnificent demonstration of his philosophy. It wasn't a computer program, it was a physical, electromechanical device designed to navigate and learn a maze.
How did the physical mouse and the abstract concept of learning interact?
Well, beneath the surface of the maze was a sophisticated electromechanical relay circuit, the very same technology he had formalized in his 1937 thesis. The mouse moved, using sensors to detect the corridors. When it made a choice, the relay circuit stored the path and whether that path led to a dead end or the target.
So the maze itself was the input, and the relay circuit provided the logic and the memory.
Correct. So the first time Theseus was put in the maze, it used random trial and error until it found the target. But critically, it remembered.
And what happened next?
If you placed it at the start again, it would follow the shortest optimal path immediately. Furthermore, if you place the mouse in a new, unfamiliar section of the maze, it would search just long enough to connect to a location it did remember, and then it would zip directly to the target.
That's classic iterative machine learning. Acquire knowledge, optimize the path, and use prior knowledge to accelerate future solutions.
And that's why Mays and Gilbert's comment that Theseus inspired the whole field of AI is so justified. It proved that the abstract concept of learning could be reduced to a mechanical, logical process defined by on-off switches and memory storage, making the concept of intelligent machines tangible.
Another major pillar of early AI was game theory, and Shannon tackled the ultimate intellectual game, chess.
Right. His 1950 paper, Programming a Computer for Playing Chess, remains influential. It was one of the very first detailed analyses of how an artificial machine could approach the strategic complexity of chess, laying the foundation for programs that would one day challenge world champions.
And he didn't just pose the question. He proposed the actual architectural strategy for the algorithm.
He did. He described the process of move selection and position scoring. Since the computer couldn't possibly search every potential move path, he proposed basic strategies to restrict the number of possibilities, what we now call search tree pruning. The core decision-making process was based on a minimax procedure.
Minimax, which means finding the move that maximizes your minimum gain, assuming your opponent will play optimally to minimize your advantage.
Precisely. And this required an evaluation function. a single mathematical formula that assigns a numerical value to a given chessboard position. This is where his genius for abstraction came in again.
Can you elaborate on the factors in his evaluation function? What was it looking at?
He started with traditional material values, pawn is 1, rook is 5, queen is 9, but he incorporated complex positional factors to assess the strategic quality of the board. For example, the computer was programmed to subtract half a point for doubled, backward, or isolated pawns-all structural weaknesses.
Okay.
Conversely, it would add a fractional value, say 0.1 point, for every legal move available, which is a measure of mobility.
So his system understood that a mobile knight, even though it's worth 3 points, might be more valuable than a paralyzed rook that's worth 5 points, based on their strategic quality defined by the math.
It was the first time that positional intuition was translated into cold, hard numbers, and it was in this paper that he formalized the incredible complexity barrier of the game, giving us the famous Shannon number.
What exactly is the Shannon number?
It is his 1949 estimate for the total number of plausible legal game continuations, or the game tree complexity, in chess. He calculated it to be approximately 10^120.
That number 10^112 is vast, but what does that scale actually mean for you, for the listener?
Well, to give you a sense of scale, the total number of atoms in the observable universe is estimated to be around $10. Shannon's number is 40 orders of magnitude larger than that. You couldn't store the possibilities for a game of chess on all the storage space in the universe, let alone calculate them.
That vastness, $10, that's the moment the computer stops being a calculator and must start becoming intelligent. It has to use heuristics and evaluation functions, just as Shannon proposed.
It confirmed that brute force exhaustive analysis was impossible, compelling the need for smart strategic shortcuts, the very foundation of modern search algorithms and AI.
I think we've firmly established his unparalleled mathematical genius, but the sources also show a side of Shannon that was driven by sheer unbridled intellectual playfulness. These unconventional pursuits feel less like distractions and more like another form of applied mathematics.
That's the key. Whether he was juggling, unicycling, or inventing, he was always focused on the mechanical application of order, timing, and prediction. He was a proficient juggler, often riding a unicycle down the halls of Bell Labs while simultaneously juggling.
And his mechanical inventions were truly eccentric.
The variety is incredible. He built a machine called Phareobac, which was a Roman numeral computer. He built sophisticated juggling machines and, later in life, a mechanical device that could solve the Rubik's Cube.
But the inventions that capture the imagination are the ones that blend physics and mischief.
Definitely. We have the rocket-powered frisbees and the story of his attempts to conquer the physical world with math. My favorite anecdote involves the plastic foam shoes designed for walking on water.
Water walking shoes.
Yes. They were essentially large flotation devices. He designed them and tested them on a nearby lake, presumably seeking that perfect balance between surface area and buoyancy. He just loved the absurdity of seeing physics in action, creating a spectacle while demonstrating a mechanical solution to an impossible problem.
And, of course, the flame-throwing trumpets. The man who defined the digital universe spent his downtime engineering novelty flamethrowers. What was the purpose of the trumpet?
The purpose, as best we can tell from the sources, was simply spectacular fun. It was a beautiful example of engineering mischief, taking the principles of fluid dynamics, fuel, and pressure to convert a musical instrument into a fire-breathing prop. This dichotomy is perhaps the greatest insight into his personality, a mind that saw the deepest mathematical structures of the cosmos and still had time for high-quality pranks.
This relentless drive to abstract complexity and apply math to seemingly random systems also made him uniquely effective in a field far more conventional than rockets or mice: finance. His financial acuity is often completely overlooked.
It should not be. Shannon was a known, highly successful private investor who even gave lectures on his investment strategy. The data is astonishing. A 1986 Barron's report comparing his portfolio performance to 1,026 major mutual funds showed that Shannon achieved a higher return than 1,025 of them.
That's an almost perfect track record. That's insane.
His overall portfolio return from the late 1950s up to 1986 was approximately 28% per annum, which actually stacked up slightly better than Warren Buffett's 27% return over the period 1965 to 1995.
How did he do that? How did he achieve such a market-beating performance? Did he use some information theory secret?
He used a principle that utilized probability and market volatility, later labeled Shannon's demon. The concept is elegant, simple, and counterintuitive. It relies on the assumption that markets are random, but volatile, They jitter up and down.
Tell us how Shannon's demon works in practice.
Okay, you start by forming a portfolio of equal parts cash and a single stock, say 50% cash, 50% stock. The demon's only instruction is to rebalance that portfolio regularly, returning it to the exact 50-50 ratio, regardless of whether the stock has gone up or down.
Okay, so if the stock goes up, your portfolio might become 60% stock, 40% cash. To rebalance, you are forced to sell some of that stock.
You sell the gains and increase your cash holding. If the stock goes down, your portfolio might become 40% stock, 60% cash. To rebalance, you are forced to buy more stock, increasing your position at a lower price.
So by forcing himself to rebalance constantly, he was systematically selling high and buying low, profiting from the natural random volatility, the jitter of the market, without ever having to predict its long-term direction.
Exactly. As long as the stock doesn't crash to zero and moves randomly, the strategy generates wealth over time. It's a pure, probabilistic, abstract, mathematical solution applied to a messy, real-world system. It's information theory applied to money seeing the signal of profit hidden in the noise of random price movements.
And finally, his interest in applying math to beat systems even extended to the casino floor, resulting in the co-invention of the first wearable computer.
He co-invented this with his friend and colleague, mathematician Edward O. Thorpe. The device was small enough to be worn hidden in a shoe and was used to calculate the speed of the roulette wheel and the ball in real time.
So it wasn't a magic trick, it was physics and calculation.
It was pure applied physics. They calculated the initial conditions and, using the computer, predicted with an improved probability where the ball would land, thus altering the odds in their favor. It was illegal, of course, but it was yet another perfect example of Shannon's core belief. Any seemingly complex or random system, a chess match, a communication channel, or a roulette wheel, is ultimately susceptible to abstract mathematical analysis.
Claude Shannon's professional career saw him move from Bell Labs to MIT, where he held a professorship from 1956 until his retirement in 1978. He then spent his later years dealing with the cruel irony of Alzheimer's disease before passing in 2001.
It is a real tragedy that the man who gave us the foundation for processing and storing information had his own memory robbed from him. Yet the magnitude of his legacy only continues to grow.
That James Gleick quote about him really encapsulates the totality of his impact.
It does, Gleick stated. Einstein looms large, and rightly so. But we're not living in the relativity age, we're living in the information age. It's Shannon, whose fingerprints are on every electronic device we own, every computer screen we gaze into, every means of digital communication. He provided the mathematical language for everything digital.
It's the foundation of the foundation.
And his influence is widely acknowledged within the scientific community. We know of 6 statues dedicated to him across the U.S., including at MIT and Bell Labs, and in his hometown of Gaylord, Michigan. AT&T named their research division Shannon Labs, and he was the first recipient of the Claude Shannon Award in 1973.
And even the modern family of large language models developed by Anthropic Claude was named in his honor.
A fitting tribute.
So if we look across his entire life, from designing the bet using Boolean algebra to predicting the ultimate complexity of chess and creating a market-beating investment strategy, what is the single synthesizing takeaway for the learner today?
I think the key takeaway is that Shannon's polymathic approach was his methodology. He moved freely across engineering, math, genetics, cryptography, and finance. The reason he found the simple foundational answers, the bit, the theoretical limits of compression, the definition of an unbreakable cipher, is because he refused to be confined by the traditional boundaries of his discipline. He used abstract mathematics as a universal solvent.
He had that rare, amazing clarity of vision, as Robert Gallagher noted, to find the right, simple, abstract theory for utterly complicated real-world problems.
He demonstrated that profound technological progress is unlocked when you take the simple, powerful tools from one domain like algebra and apply them to a completely unrelated, complex domain like electrical relays or population genetics. The answer to one field's greatest challenge often lies hidden, perfected in another.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to chew on, based on the ultimate lesson of Claude Shannon's life. His ability to bridge seemingly unrelated fields, from Mendelian genetics to cryptography, from electrical circuits to playing card strategy, is what created the information age.
So, consider for yourself, what foundational complex system today is waiting for a simple abstract mathematical theory, a perfect piece of game theory or systems prediction, currently hidden in an unexpected field like juggling, investing, or gaming to unlock the next technological revolution? What new Magna Carta is waiting for its Shannon to be written?
Welcome to the debate. Today, we're analyzing the colossal legacy of Claude Shannon, a man who is widely, and I think rightly, called the father of information theory. But the source material on his life highlights this fascinating division in his genius. Two distinct, massive intellectual contributions, separated by about a decade, and both of them just fundamentally shaped the modern digital world.
They really did. You have his 1937 master's thesis on relay circuits, which he did as a graduate student, and then you have his 1948 paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication. I mean, it's an incredibly rare kind of genius who can create two separate revolutions in a single lifetime.
So that brings us to our central question. Which of Shannon's twin achievements, his 1937 master's thesis on logic circuits or his 1948 paper on information theory, is the more profoundly significant, the more foundational contribution to the digital age we all inhabit now? I'm going to argue that the 1937 thesis is the essential prerequisite, the work that first made digital computation physically possible.
And I'll be arguing that the 1948 paper, by defining the universal laws and the limits of communication, provides the theoretical dominance and the conceptual blueprint for our age. So while the circuits are necessary, sure, the mathematics of communication define the entire structure of, well, the universe of digital possibilities.
The true starting point for the digital age isn't a theory of communication. It has to be the physical, functional logic of the machine itself. And that, for me, starts with Shannon's 1937 master's thesis, a symbolic analysis of relay and switching circuits. This work, and he completed it when he was just 21, was absolutely groundbreaking because it offered a complete formal description for a very practical engineering problem.
The problem being those complex telephone switching circuits, right?
Exactly. Shannon demonstrated a revolutionary insight that George Boole's abstract algebra of logic, Boolean algebra, could be perfectly mapped onto simple electrical switches, or relays. So an open switch is false, or a 0. A closed switch is true, or a 1. By treating circuits mathematically, he showed that any logical numerical relationship could be constructed and manipulated electrically.
Which certainly transformed engineering practice.
It did more than that. The source material validates this, noting that this work is often called the birth certificate of the digital revolution. It changed digital circuit design from an art to a science. Before Shannon, designers were using trial and error to build circuits. After him, they used rigorous mathematical proofs. This established the foundational hardware logic, the theoretical blueprint for the digital circuit that makes all subsequent computation and communication possible. Without this functional basis, the entire information age is, well, it's not existent.
Okay, I readily acknowledge the 1937 thesis was a crucial intellectual leap for engineering, but I come at it from a fundamentally different perspective, and that's scale. While that work defined the mechanism, the specific architecture of the switch, the 1948 paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, defined the universe of digital interaction itself. It established the rules of the game, regardless of the physical implementation of the pieces.
What do you mean by universe of digital interaction? That sounds a little grand.
I mean that Shannon invented the entire academic discipline of information theory. He gave us the tools to quantify this ephemeral concept of information. Crucially, he formally defined entropy in this context, which is the measure of uncertainty reduced when a message is received. Before Shannon, information was this vague idea. Afterward, it was a precise, measurable quantity. And it was in this paper that he formally introduced the term bit.
A definitive naming moment, certainly, and a very powerful definition.
But the power is in its universality. This work is referred to as the Magna Carta of the information age because it established the absolute theoretical limits on how quickly and reliably information can be transmitted, the famous channel capacity theorem. Its influence transcends simple electronics. We see its application in fields ranging from the invention of the compact disc and the development of the internet to fundamental advances in cosmology and the understanding of biological processes. It provides the universal metric that dictates the very limits of what any digital machine, built on your 1937 logic, can ever achieve.
I see why you emphasize the theoretical limits, but let me offer a different perspective on that sequence of necessity. At the end of the day, all digital communication utterly relies, on the physical infrastructure of circuits. Shannon's 1937 thesis created the necessary foundational concept, using electrical switches to implement Boolean logic, which is the, quote, fundamental concept that underlies all electronic digital computers, end quote.
But that only speaks to the electrical computer. The information theory applies to signal fires and drum beats.
True, but we're talking about the digital world, not just abstract communication. Without the ability to reliably manipulate those ones and zeros within a mathematically rigorous machine, the computer, the abstract theory of communication has no platform, no mechanism, and no means to be executed on the scale necessary for an information age. The logic of the hardware was the functional prerequisite.
That's an interesting point, suggesting the theory is just a passenger on the machine. But I would argue the 1948 work provided the conceptual physics, the language, the universal mathematics, and the absolute limits for all encoding and transmission. This is the true core process of the information age, moving information efficiently.
But if the component doesn't exist, the efficiency calculation is meaningless.
Not at all. While the 1937 thesis provided the detailed theory for the switch, the single component, the 1948 paper provided the theory of what the switch must accomplish and how efficiently it can do so with a margin for error. And that's regardless of whether that switch is an electrical relay, a vacuum tube, or a quantum entanglement state. That is why the source material notes that Shannon's influence here is compared to the inventor of the alphabet has had on literature. The alphabet is not the printing press. It defines the structure of all ideas that can be conveyed across any medium. The 1937 work merely created a particularly elegant printing press. And furthermore, the breadth of the 1948 paper's theoretical application it immediately spilled over into non-computing fields that are absolutely critical to the modern world. I'm talking about security and cryptography. I'm not convinced that prioritizing the hardware prerequisite really accounts for the universal security framework that stems directly from communication theory.
I grant you the conceptual overlap is strong, but how does measuring information entropy directly lead to unbreakable security systems?
Because the entire premise of breaking a cipher is reducing the uncertainty, the entropy, of the message. Shannon used the probabilistic and quantitative analysis inherent in the 1948 information theory to rigorously analyze ciphers. This led to his declassified 1949 publication, Communication Theory of Secrecy Systems, where he proved that the one-time pad, a cryptographic key only once, is theoretically unbreakable. And why? Because its key has the same entropy as the message itself. There is simply no information gained by knowing the ciphertext.
So the information theory provided the mathematical definition of perfect secrecy.
Precisely. This established him as the founding father of modern cryptography and laid the groundwork for modern symmetric key algorithms like DS and AES. This universal security framework, which dictates how we protect data transmission globally, is a conceptual outgrowth of the communication theory, not the logic circuit design. It defined what security is in a digital world.
That's a compelling argument regarding the definition of security. But let's counter that theoretical universality with the sheer, immediate, practical power of the 1937 thesis. The early applications weren't abstract at all. They were highly practical engineering feats that immediately simplified critical infrastructure.
Like the telephone switches you mentioned earlier.
Oh, much more than that. The whole point of the thesis was to demonstrate how Boolean algebra could be used to simplify the previously incomprehensibly complex arrangement of electromechanical relays. This wasn't a conceptual idea that took decades to implement. It was instantly operational. It saved huge amounts of material and complexity in telephone exchanges. This focus on elegant functional engineering is visible throughout his career, linking back directly to the practical rigor established in his thesis.
Give me an example of that practical rigor outside of switching circuits.
Okay, look at his work on the signal flow graph in 1942. This was a method he invented to visually and mathematically represent the flow of signals through a system, originally while analyzing analog computers. It allows complex systems to be analyzed and optimized rapidly. This is pure engineering practicality, designed to eliminate unnecessary components and simplify physical design. And if we want to talk about immediate impact, consider pulse code modulation, or PCM, a technology he co-invented that digitized voice signals, laying the foundation for modern digital telephone networks.
PCM is definitely a crucial technology for the information age.
And finally, that focus on physical application even led to some whimsical yet serious inventions, like the first wearable computer he helped devise, a mechanism for calculating roulette odds right at the table. His genius was rooted in abstracting a problem and then building the logical mechanism to solve it. And that methodology, that entire approach, was codified in the 1937 thesis. Let's pivot to the enduring conceptual dominance within their respective fields. If the 1948 theory is the universally dominant foundational concept, why does the source material credit the 1937 work with establishing the basis for Boolean algebra in digital electronics, a logic cited as essential to all digital electronic circuits?
Well, the problem with that argument is the 1937 work was so quickly absorbed into engineering, it became an accepted methodology, a fundamental tool in the toolkit of every electrical engineer. It was solved. It is now, well, it's invisible infrastructure.
But becoming invisible infrastructure means it is so fundamental, we don't even question it. It's the underlying physical reality. The thesis created the theoretical basis for the machine itself, the operational core of computation. The 1948 paper is merely a framework for the data flowing through that core. Without the logic framework, the machine is just a complex arrangement of switches, not a computer.
But the 1948 paper is field-defining in a way the 1937 thesis is not. The source notes that in a 1973 collection of T papers in information theory, Shannon authored or co-authored 12 of 49 cited papers, and he's still regarded as the most important post-1948 contributor to the theory. This is crucial. His work wasn't a discrete, solved engineering problem that just became standard practice. It created a living, expanding discipline that he continued to dominate and shape conceptually for decades. The work of 48 defined a science that continues to generate new questions in mathematics, physics, and biology, whereas the work of 37 solidified an engineering concept that is now, as you say, taken for granted.
We should also consider Shannon's work in artificial intelligence, a field he helped found by co-organizing the 1956 Dartmouth workshop. This aspect of his genius, focused on building and modeling intelligent systems, aligns much more closely with the logic and engineering application of the 1937 thesis.
I don't see how. I mean, AI today is a lot about processing vast quantities of information, which is pure 1948 theory.
But look at the early implementations. Consider his Theseus machine from 1950. This was the first electrical device designed to learn by trial and error. It was a physical maze-solving mouse built using electromechanical relays, the very technology described in his 1937 thesis. This focus on physically modeling learning and problem-solving through logical iterative circuits is cited as the foundation of artificial intelligence. The very idea of an intelligent system emerged from the ability to rigorously define logical processes in hardware.
That's a beautiful example of physical embodiment, I'll give you that. But even his foundational AI work relied more heavily on the abstract quantitative thinking that defined information theory than on the physical relay mechanism. While Theseus showed a logical mechanism, his famous 1950 paper on programming chess computers approached intelligence as a problem of possibility and measurement.
How so?
He estimated the vast complexity of the game tree, the Shannon number, of approximately 10 to the 120th possible moves. That is not an engineering problem, that is a quantitative problem of possibility, entropy, and information. His approach to programming chess relied on abstract, quantitative analysis and developing evaluation functions to prune that vast tree. He wasn't just building a circuit to model a mouse, he was defining the theoretical limits of what a computational intelligence could or must know to function effectively.
The 1948 work defined the search space. The 1937 work provided the basic logic gate to implement the search. Defining the search space is the deeper, more profound theoretical contribution to AI.
But the logic gate provides the necessary structure to even begin the search.
And the channel capacity theorem dictates how quickly the results of that search can be transmitted and processed. We are left with two colossal achievements.
Ultimately, I maintain that the 1937 thesis is the indispensable bridge. It took abstract mathematical logic, George Boole's work which sat dormant for nearly a century, and made it physically and electrically realizable in circuits. This conceptual breakthrough led directly to the digital computer. It is the necessary antecedent, providing the literal, functional ones and zeros that the information theory later codified, measured, and optimized. Without the functional basis for digital computing, the communication theory remains an elegant but unimplemented mathematical curiosity.
And I maintain that the 1948 theory provided the abstract, mathematically rigorous framework that elevated digital technology from clever engineering, however revolutionary that thesis was, to a universal science of communication. It gave the digital age its mathematical soul, defining not just what we can build, but the universal limits and efficiencies of all communication. The scope of this theory transformed fields from pure mathematics to biology, cementing Shannon's legacy on par with figures like Newton because he created a field from scratch, a field that the circuits of the 1937 thesis merely serve.
A universal science that relies entirely on a machine architecture that the 1937 thesis first made possible.
Indeed. And I think this discussion really highlights the profound reality of Shannon's legacy. He was a true polymath whose capacity to work freely and brilliantly across mathematics, engineering, and cryptography resulted in two works that are simultaneously essential. Both the conceptual foundation, the language of information, and the structural reality, the logic of the machine, are indispensable facets of Claude Shannon's colossal contribution to the modern world.
We'll leave the listeners to weigh whether the creation of the machine itself or the definition of the universal laws governing that machine is the more fundamental contribution, knowing that both pillars support the digital world we live in.